Welcome back, lovely ladies. If you want to become the woman of your dreams, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. And join our Patreon for even more exclusive content. Now, let's dive into today's story.
Javier crouched behind a row of stacked crates near the waterfront, trying to calm his breathing. He was 29, lean and a little taller than most, with carefully combed brown hair now plastered to his forehead from sweat and the nightly humidity. Behind him, the wharf was alive with men unloading shipments and barking instructions, their voices echoing against the silent, starless sky. He wondered how many of them knew about the raids happening all across the city. The air smelled like fish and rotting seaweed, but he inhaled deeply, letting the pungent odor center him. If there was ever a time to keep his wits about him, it was now. He was no stranger to danger. For years, he had passed out illegal pamphlets and organized covert meetings for the cause he believed in. Most of that had been in secret back rooms or abandoned warehouses, deep in the slums of the capital. But in the past week, the authorities had cracked down harder than ever. Every day, there were new arrests. By the hour, people disappeared into the dungeons beneath the old fortress in the central district, never to be heard from again. Someone had tipped off the authorities that Javier was a leading activist. His face had begun appearing on government bulletins, wanted for treason, sabotage, and incitement. The local underground networks had burned most of their old hideouts, forcing revolutionaries like him into the streets, where danger lurked around every corner. He swallowed, thinking of the plans Sophia had laid out. She was a childhood friend, about his age, someone he trusted completely. They had grown up on the same block, playing games among the cramped buildings and turning chores into competitions. Over the years, Sophia's warmth and sharp intellect helped him remain grounded. She was never afraid to speak her mind, never timid about calling him a fool if she thought he was being reckless. And now, she was risking everything to help him. He closed his eyes and remembered the conversation from earlier that evening. "Javier," she had said, leaning forward from across her small kitchen table, her expression set in determination. Her olive skin caught the fading sunlight, and her thick black hair was pulled into a tight bun. "They're after you in particular. You can't stay in the safe houses anymore. Everyone's eyes will be on you the moment you show your face." Her apartment, cramped as it was, offered a short respite from the chaos outside. The chipped paint on the walls and the flickering light bulb in the corner didn't bother either of them. Safety was what mattered, and she had done her best to make her place a secure spot. A whistling kettle on the stove gave off the only truly comforting sound, though the tension in the air weighed heavily on them both. He had frowned, crossing his arms as he paced the little space between the stove and her bookshelf. "So I disappear, just like that? Then what good will I be to the cause? I can't just run and hide while everyone else is out there." Sophia pursed her lips. "I'm not asking you to run. I need you to blend in. There's a group of women in the revolution who are stepping in where men like you can't. They're less suspected. The government thinks women are less dangerous. It's ridiculous, but we can use that to our advantage." Javier had narrowed his eyes, sensing where this was heading. "You're suggesting that you join them," she said softly, "as one of them." Javier stared at her. The idea was so audacious that part of him wanted to dismiss it on the spot, but he knew better than to scoff at a plan of Sophia's. She was a strategist through and through, always 5 steps ahead of everyone else. "You want me to disguise myself?" "Yes," she replied. "It's temporary, but it's the only way you can stay in the country without them catching you. They won't expect you hidden in plain sight." He remembered the knot in his stomach at hearing those words. It wasn't fear alone. It was the realization of how desperate the situation had become. If he wanted to continue his work, If he still wanted to pass along crucial information, he would need to become unrecognizable to the authorities. That was how the plan was born. And that was how, standing behind the crates by the dock, Javier now awaited the final piece of the disguise. Sofia had promised to meet him there with some garments and official identification that would be crucial for his next step. He tugged at the collar of his worn shirt, feeling the sweat trickle down the back of his neck. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He pivoted, ready to run if it was a soldier. But Sofia emerged from the dark, a scarf wrapped around her head. She carried a burlap sack. "Come on," she said under her breath, gesturing for him to follow. They squeezed into a nearby storage shed, its interior lit by a single battery-powered lamp. Sofia dropped the sack on the floor and knelt. "I've got everything here." She pulled out a folded dress, a light blouse, a pair of shoes, some undergarments, plus a wig that seemed to match the color of his own hair, medium brown, wavy but trimmed to frame the face. Finally, she handed him a small mirror. He looked at the items and exhaled. "I'll do whatever it takes," he murmured. Sofia helped him change. The moment was tense but focused, both of them determined to make his disguise as convincing as possible. Javier's build was athletic, though not bulky. With some strategic padding around his hips and chest, plus the subtle shift of posture Sofia taught him, he began to look more like a slender woman with serious eyes than the hunted activist the authorities were desperate to catch. He slipped on the long skirt, then the blouse, noticing how restrictive it felt around his arms. The wig, pinned into place, transformed his appearance further. Sofia fussed over details such as how to tilt his chin and the angle at which he might hold his shoulders. She worked quickly and silently, occasionally giving short instructions. When she was satisfied, she stepped back and handed him the small mirror. Under the dim light, Javier scarcely recognized himself. The reflection was that of a woman in her late 20s, with delicate features, a somber expression, and an air of quiet determination. "Julieta," Sofia said quietly. "That's the name I put on your new identification papers. Julieta Arroyo." Javier let out a long breath. "Julieta. It's safer if we call you that when we're in the open." He nodded, marveling at how a few garments and a wig could change so much. "All right, I'm ready." They slipped out of the shed without drawing attention. The city streets were calmer now, the late hour driving most workers and pedestrians inside. Military patrols still lurked, but Sofia led him down narrow alleys, past decrepit staircases, and behind hedges of tall grass that lined abandoned lots. Her memory of back roads proved invaluable. She guided him as though she were navigating her own bedroom. After 30 minutes, they arrived at a once grand building with boarded-up windows and walls riddled by bullet holes. "This is where we meet," Sofia said softly. "The group is inside. They're waiting for us." Javier's pulse quickened. He had always been the one rallying others, never the one forced to hide behind a fabricated identity. But he felt no reluctance in stepping forward. Everything they had worked for, the whole vision of a freer society, demanded that he adapt and do what was necessary. Sofia knocked on a side door 3 times. A small slot slid open, revealing eyes that studied them both. The lock clicked, and the door opened just wide enough for them to squeeze through. Inside, candlelight flickered against walls lined with tattered posters calling for change. About 10 women, all appearing to be in their 20s or 30s, stood in a semicircle. Their eyes drifted from Sofia to Javier, each of them clearly curious. They were a tough-looking group, many with scars or bruises from scuffles with the regime's enforcers. "Everyone, this is Julieta," Sofia announced. "She'll be working with us. It's safer if we limit details about her past for now. We have to trust each other." A tall woman in a threadbare jacket stepped forward. "I'm Daniela," she said briskly, studying Javier's features with a discerning eye. Her gaze lingered for a moment, but she did not question his presence. If Sophia vouches for you, we trust you. Just don't compromise us. Javier offered a timid nod, pitching his voice a bit higher than usual to maintain the disguise. Thank you for letting me join, he said. The next few days were dizzying. Javier, now Julieta, found a tiny spare room at the back of that building to sleep in. By day, the women would scatter around the city, keeping eyes and ears open for hints of raids or shipments of supplies. By night, they convened in secret to plan protests or distribute propaganda. Javier was struck by how effectively this group operated under the radar, using coded language and low-tech methods that evaded the authorities' search for insurgents. He discovered he had to adjust his entire behavior to keep from being discovered. Whenever he spoke, he had to remember to soften his voice. Whenever he walked, he had to adapt to the subtle shifts in balance that came with wearing long skirts. Still, the most eye-opening aspect was witnessing the obstacles these women faced in trying to be heard. Even though they were part of the revolution, they had to fight twice as hard to have their voices taken seriously among other rebels. One evening, Daniela and 2 others returned from a mission with bruised faces and torn clothes. Javier rushed to help them. As he dabbed a wet cloth across Daniela's split lip, she winced, but managed a short laugh. Security forces on the Eastern Bridge recognized us from the last protest, she muttered. They think we're easy targets. They'll pay for what they did, said another woman who was cradling a wounded arm, but not by us losing our heads and striking back blindly. We have to strike smart. Javier stared at the patches of blood staining their clothes. He had been involved in more than a few altercations himself, but he couldn't shake the sense that these women were forced to endure hardships on every front. As Julieta, he experienced how passing soldiers leered or dismissed them. Whenever Javier, disguised as Julieta, tried to ask questions or coordinate with other cells of the revolution, most of which were run by men, he faced condescending attitudes he rarely encountered in his former identity. There were times he found it almost maddening, but it fueled him to work even harder. He learned how to transport medical supplies under the ruse of carrying domestic items. He discovered new safe routes for smuggling ammunition. As the group realized Julieta was resourceful and calm in a crisis, they began to trust him more. Meanwhile, Sophia remained his closest confidant. When they had moments to talk alone, she would offer him small encouragements and also check on how he was coping with the continuous subterfuge. One afternoon, they stood on a rooftop overlooking the crumbling skyline. Bullet holes peppered nearby buildings. The streets below, once teeming with life, now had fewer people walking about for fear of random arrests. Sophia closed her eyes as a warm breeze drifted by. I almost can't remember what the city was like before all of this started, she murmured. Every day they crack down harder, but at least we're doing something. Javier, dressed in a plain skirt and loose blouse, nodded. I wish it didn't have to be like this, but we can't give up. Our people deserve better. He glanced at her, admiring the faint lines of worry etched into her face, lines that told the story of late nights and hidden anxieties. Sophia had always been strong-willed, always a step ahead in strategy, but he sensed the toll it took on her emotionally. We'll keep pushing, she said. Then she tilted her head to look at him. You've adjusted quickly to working with Daniela and the others. They speak highly of you. Well, of Julieta. He let out a small laugh. I'm just trying not to get anyone caught. They fell silent. The wind died down, leaving them in the stillness of the rooftop. After a few moments, Sophia set a hand on his shoulder. We'll get through this, all of us. That night, their group met in a hidden cellar beneath the building. Candles lit the space, casting shadows that danced across the old stone walls. A large map of the city lay on a low table. Daniela pointed to key checkpoints along major roads, scribbling notes on a piece of paper. Tomorrow evening there's a planned march. We've heard rumors that many citizens intend to come out and protest for better wages and living conditions. We need to support them, but we also need to anticipate the military's response. If we can disrupt the lines of communication between the soldiers, we may gain valuable time. Sophia nodded. We can place watchers on each corner to warn us if reinforcements start arriving. Javier joined the circle, clearing his throat. I have some old contacts who used to help me. Help our movement. They might still be able to jam the soldiers' radios for a short window, just enough to cause some confusion. Several of the women, including Daniela, turned to look at him. He realized he had almost slipped and referred to his old identity, but they seemed to trust Julieta enough not to question. That's helpful, Daniela said. We'll coordinate. Any advantage is critical right now. At dawn, a flurry of small tasks began, forging handouts, distributing supplies, and finalizing escape routes. Javier found himself running from one room to the next, collecting everything they needed. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of his reflection in a dusty mirror or in the glint of a window, and it still startled him how different he looked. But there was no time to dwell on the strangeness of it all. That evening, the march began near the old train station. People poured into the street, holding signs and chanting slogans that called for the downfall of the regime. Javier stayed near the back, wearing a headscarf over his wig, while Daniela, Sofia, and the others spread out through the crowd. He felt the tension in the air. The authorities would not simply let such a gathering take place without interference. He scanned the rooftops, noticing the glint of rifles in the distance. He heard the hum of trucks on a nearby avenue. Any moment now, the crackdown would begin. Sure enough, shouts erupted at the far end of the street. A line of soldiers marched in, ordering the crowd to disperse. People refused, shouting back. Then came the tear gas. Smoke canisters hissed and tumbled across the pavement, spewing thick clouds that burned eyes and throats. Screams rang out, and the once organized march became a panicked scramble. Daniela rushed forward to help direct some of the protesters to safety, while Sofia grabbed Javier's arm. Come on, we need to get to the side street. He coughed, tears streaming from the gas, but stumbled after her. Just as they turned a corner, they saw a squad of enforcers rounding people up and herding them into trucks. One soldier charged toward Sofia, swinging a baton. Javier leaped between them, instinct taking over. The soldier's baton cracked against Javier's forearm, sending a sharp jolt of pain all the way to his shoulder. He grimaced, but managed to shove the soldier away. Sofia grabbed his hand. We have to move, now. They ran down an alley, narrowly dodging a second group of soldiers. Heart pounding, Javier spotted a group of women from their cell, helping a wounded protester. Bullets whizzed overhead, pinging off the walls. He glanced back and saw more soldiers blocking the exit. In that split second, he realized someone needed to distract them, or they'd all be trapped. Swallowing his fear, he motioned to Sofia. Take them and go through the back route. I'll hold them off for a few seconds. Sofia's eyes widened. No, you can't. Just do it, he snapped, before softening his voice. Trust me. She met his gaze, understanding the risk. Then she ushered the women past him and down a narrower path behind a collapsed fence. Javier pressed himself against a brick wall, taking quick stock of his surroundings. There was an overturned crate, some debris, no weapons. The soldiers were approaching. He inhaled sharply, then kicked the crate across the alley, making a loud clatter. The sudden noise startled the soldiers. He darted out just enough for them to see his silhouette and chase after him. Once he was sure they were following, he sprinted in the opposite direction, leading them away from Sofia and the others. Bullets tore into the nearby bricks. After a desperate dash, Javier ducked behind an old rusted car, panting and clutching his throbbing arm. The soldier's footsteps echoed on the pavement, but then scattered in different directions. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to steady his nerves. A lone figure in uniform passed frighteningly close to his hiding spot, but missed him in the darkness. Eventually, the search party moved on. Once the coast was clear, Javier slipped into a back alley and circled around the block, heart still hammering from the close call. He found Sofia and the others a few streets away, assisting more protesters who had been gassed or roughed up. When Sofia saw him approach, the relief on her face was instant. She helped him tend to his bruised arm, and they guided the group back to their safe location. In the days that followed, videos of the crackdown circulated in secret among the rebels. News spread about the brutality, further inflaming public outrage. Meanwhile, Javier, still in his disguise as Julieta, continued to slip beneath the radar. No one in the government suspected a woman. Inside the revolution's network, though, rumors began to swirl about a new organizer with a knack for daring maneuvers. Some people heard whispers of a woman named Julieta orchestrating diversions, delivering crucial intelligence, and brazenly confronting soldiers. A few doubted whether any of it was true, while others hailed her as a figure to watch. Javier tried to keep his head down, not wanting to draw too much attention that might lead to an investigation of Julieta's background. But the efforts to remain anonymous clashed with the growing legend that was inadvertently forming around him. One afternoon, Daniela summoned Javier, Sofia, and a few others to a cramped office in the back of their building. She tapped a small list pinned to the wall. "We have a problem. We're running out of supplies, medical kits, ammunition, even basic food rations for those hiding out. We need a new supply route, or many of our people will be at risk." Sofia crossed her arms. "What about the usual channels, the smugglers on the west side?" "They've dried up," Daniela replied. "The regime is watching them too closely." Javier spoke up quietly. "There's a place near the old industrial district. I used to arrange shipments there, hidden under loads of scrap metal and machine parts. It might still be accessible, but someone would have to reconnect with the contact. He's unreliable, but if we can convince him, we'll have a pipeline." Daniela nodded. "We can't waste any chance. Sofia, you and Julieta go, but be careful. We can't afford any mistakes. If the authorities catch on, we lose everything." They left the meeting with the address in hand. Late that night, the two of them set off toward the industrial district, traveling on foot to avoid drawing attention. The city's skyline loomed in the distance, dotted with fires burning in rubbish bins along the roads. Occasional bursts of laughter or angry shouts sounded from nearby buildings, but otherwise, the area felt eerily quiet. For a moment, as they walked, Javier couldn't help but think about how much had changed since those carefree days they once shared as children. He and Sofia used to explore dusty attics, race each other through the neighborhood, and talk about what they would do when they grew up. Now they spoke about infiltration, subterfuge, and how to bring down a regime. They found the old warehouse near a disused railway track. The cracked windows and rusted metal doors gave the impression of a place long abandoned. But inside, the echoes of distant voices suggested a gathering. They edged in quietly, slipping behind tall shelves stacked with discarded machine parts. Suddenly, a light shone on them. "Stop!" a gruff voice commanded. They froze. Javier raised both hands, and Sofia did the same. Then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. A lanky man in his 30s, wearing threadbare clothes and holding a flashlight. Recognition dawned on his face as he aimed the beam at Javier. "Wait, I've seen you before." Javier felt his stomach tighten. "I'm here to see Marlon," he said, using a careful tone. The man frowned, lowering the flashlight slightly. "He doesn't see just anyone." Sofia interjected. "We're friends of the resistance. Tell him we have a proposition for new shipments. We know the old route near the scrapyard." At the mention of the yard, the man's eyes flickered with interest. He signaled for them to follow him through a dimly lit corridor into a cavernous open space where a group of scruffy workers seemed to be haggling over crates of goods. An older man with a salt and pepper beard and a scar across his cheek stood at the center of the negotiations. "Marlin," the lanky man announced. "They say they know the old route." Marlin's gaze traveled over Sophia, then fixed on Javier. Javier could sense the man was trying to place him, though he presumably looked like a different person now, dressed as Julieta. Still, his posture was guarded, as though he suspected some ruse. "What do you want?" Marlin asked tersely. "An arrangement," Javier said, pitching his voice higher. "We can funnel your goods into the city, to the revolution, if you'll share some of your supplies in return." Marlin tapped his fingers on a nearby crate. "The authorities are on high alert. My smugglers are risking their lives every day. What are you offering that others can't?" Sophia took over the negotiation. "We have safe houses that aren't compromised, and we can divert attention away from your shipments. Our people are organized, well-connected on the streets. If you help us, we'll help you." Marlin stared at them for a long moment. Then he beckoned them closer, lowering his voice. "All right. I'll send a small test shipment first. If it gets through, we'll talk about a bigger arrangement. But if you fail, or if I see even a hint that this is a trap..." He trailed off, leaving the threat unspoken. "We won't fail," Javier said firmly. They stayed for another hour, ironing out the details of where and when the test shipment would be loaded. Javier found himself slipping back into his old habits, speaking confidently about logistics and routes. Occasionally he noticed a curious glance from Marlin and his men. Sophia would place a supportive hand on his arm, letting him know he was handling it well. As they left, the weight of their new responsibility hung over them. If they succeeded, the revolution might finally have the resources it needed. If they failed, they would not only risk their lives, but endanger the entire movement. Back at the safe house, Daniela and the others waited anxiously for news. When Sophia explained the details, a sense of relief washed over the group. They finally had a glimmer of hope for replenishing their supplies. In the days that followed, Javier helped orchestrate the route's logistics. He made sure to vary the hours, to assign watchers along the path, and to use small decoys in case security forces caught on. The night of the first shipment arrived with the threat of heavy rain and an ominous forecast, but they pressed forward. Sophia and Javier supervised from a hidden vantage point on a hillside that overlooked a narrow road leading into the city. One by one, crates were loaded onto a battered truck under the cover of darkness. Javier could hardly breathe as the truck slowly rolled down the muddy lane, passing near a checkpoint. 2 soldiers loitered by the barrier, complaining about the rain. The watchers gave a signal from behind a row of trees, indicating that the soldiers were not paying close attention. To Javier's astonishment, the truck made it through without incident. The watchers sent discreet signals all along the route, guiding the vehicle to the safe point. Sophia exhaled a breath she had been holding, and Javier felt relief course through him. They scrambled down the hill to reconvene with the others. In the following weeks, the arrangement with Marlin grew more robust. Medical kits, food, and even some weapons trickled in. The group stored everything in secret caches, distributing them among various cells of the revolution. Javier, standing as Julieta, quietly rose among the network, as more people came to rely on these shipments. Through it all, Javier became acutely aware of the daily challenges the women faced. Whenever they left the safe house, they risked harassment from soldiers or scorn from those who believed women had no place in armed struggle. Yet these women pressed on, unwavering. Javier saw the strong sense of solidarity they fostered, and it deepened the bond he felt with them. He worked side by side with Daniela, who rarely showed tenderness, but who nonetheless expressed gratitude for his efforts, albeit in gruff acknowledgments. As for Sophia, their connection took on a new depth. Late at night, when the others had gone to sleep or were out on missions, they would sit in a corner of the main room, softly lit by a single lamp. They talked about the risks they faced, the dreams they still held on to. They laughed about small memories of their childhood and comforted each other when the weight of the revolution felt overwhelming. During one such quiet moment, Sophia studied Javier's disguise. His skirt was faded from frequent use, his wig slightly askew from the day's activities, and his makeup minimal to reduce suspicion. She hesitated, then reached out to adjust a stray lock of the wig. "You're looking tired," she remarked softly. He gave a sheepish shrug. "Too many sleepless nights." She sighed, letting her hand linger on his shoulder. "The more I see you like this, the more I realize just how dangerous it is. Any slip, any soldier who looks too closely." "I know," he said, "but it's worth it. The cause needs every ounce of help." She fell silent, nodding. Then she shifted closer, lowering her voice. "Sometimes I miss the days when you were just Javier, my friend from the block. We'd dance to old tunes on the radio. We'd talk about nothing important, and life felt simpler. I miss that." He swallowed, glancing at her. "We'll have it again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but once this storm passes, we'll find those moments again. I promise." They stayed like that for a few more minutes, side by side in the soft lamplight, before returning to their responsibilities. The revolution was far from won, but their faction was making dents. The regime was losing ground in certain districts, with mass protests becoming more frequent. Tensions ran high, and the possibility of open conflict loomed ever closer. At the same time, the government began a new wave of arrests, targeting anyone even remotely suspected of treason. One afternoon, as Javier walked through a marketplace in his Julieta disguise, collecting scraps of information from vendors sympathetic to the cause, a woman hurried up to him. She had panicked eyes and clutched a small child by the hand. "Please, are you one of them? One of the rebels?" she whispered desperately. Javier's pulse quickened. "Why do you ask?" "They've taken my sister. She was just speaking out about how the prices of bread keep rising, and they took her. Please, you have to do something." Javier's heart ached at the pleas, but he could see soldiers prowling around the market. A crowd was forming, sensing that something was amiss. He whispered back, "Keep your voice down. Go to the building near the old library. Ask for Daniela. She might be able to help." The woman clutched his arm in gratitude, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, thank you." He gently pried her hands off, giving her a reassuring nod. Then he slipped away, aware of how the stares from a few nearby soldiers lingered on him. He walked calmly, trying not to break into a run. The moment he reached a quiet side street, he ducked into a hidden doorway, pressing his back against the cold stone to steady himself. Being out in public was becoming riskier by the day. When he returned to the safe house, he found it in an uproar. Daniela paced the main room, barking at a few of the women who were hurriedly packing. Sophia stood by a table, scanning an urgent note. "What's going on?" Javier asked, stepping forward. Sophia glanced up, handing him the note. "We've got word that the regime has discovered this location. We have to evacuate." His eyes flicked across the scribbled message. The authorities were planning a raid in the next few hours. They had to clear out and relocate to another safe house across the river. Adrenaline flooded Javier's veins. Without hesitation, he joined the frantic rush to gather documents, supplies, and personal belongings. Within minutes, they were on the move. A line of women, some carrying heavy crates or leading frightened refugees who had been sheltered there, snaked through the back exit. Javier helped lift a few battered boxes, ignoring the protest of his sore arm. Outside, the sun hung low, casting orange light across the bombed-out skyline. They moved through alleys, trying not to attract attention. Every so often, someone would gasp at the sight of a patrol, and they'd flatten themselves against walls. The tension was palpable. The group had to split into smaller chunks to avoid detection. Javier found himself with Sofia and 2 others, winding a route toward the riverbank. Then a loud shout echoed from behind them. Javier glanced back to see 3 soldiers emerge from a side street. Their eyes narrowed as they spotted the small group moving crates. In an instant, weapons were raised. "Stop!" one soldier bellowed. Sofia's eyes darted around for a possible escape route. They were too exposed, with no immediate shelter in sight. Javier and the others froze, hearts pounding. A second soldier stepped forward, glaring at them. "What's in the crates?" Sofia forced a polite smile, though her expression was rigid with fear. "Just clothes and personal items." One soldier smirked and approached, peering inside a crate. Javier clenched his fists at his sides. If he saw the contraband, everything was lost. "Stay calm," Javier murmured under his breath, hoping the soldier wouldn't dig too deep. The soldier yanked open the top of the crate, revealing some folded cloth. Beneath it, hidden in a compartment, were small boxes of medical supplies and pamphlets. If he lifted any of the cloth, they'd be done for. The soldier seemed unconvinced, but just as he started to move the cloth aside, an explosion in the distance rocked the street. Everyone's attention snapped to the echoing boom that rattled windows. Sirens wailed. A dark plume of smoke rose from several blocks away. Soldiers from around the district sprinted in that direction, yelling frantically into their radios. "Forget these people," one of the soldiers shouted. "We have bigger problems." They dropped the crate lid and dashed off toward the chaos. Sofia let out a shaky breath, and Javier realized he was trembling. Without another word, they hefted the crates and moved on, weaving through the confusion caused by that distant explosion. They finally reached an abandoned building by the river, where Daniela and several others were waiting. The new safe house was cramped, with water stains dripping down the walls, and a musty odor from the flooded cellar. But it was secure, at least for the moment. Everyone collapsed onto the floor or against walls, exhaustion etched on their faces. Daniela ran a hand through her hair. "We can't keep living like this. They're boxing us in. We need a major strike against them, something that forces them to negotiate, or at least to back off." Sofia, still catching her breath, nodded. "We have the supplies. We have the people. The question is how to use them." A quiet voice spoke from the corner. It was a young woman named Rosa, who had joined the group more recently. "The regime is planning a massive rally next week to show their strength. The top officials will be there. Some of the rumors say they'll even broadcast it live to the nation." Daniela's eyes narrowed. "If we can disrupt that rally, it might send a message that the government can't control everything. But it's going to be heavily guarded," Sofia pointed out. "We'd need to be cunning, not just storm it head-on." Javier shifted on his feet, pulling the wig's edge away from his sweaty forehead. "What if we slip into the rally itself, disguised as supporters, then create a distraction at the right moment?" Daniela considered this. "Yes, infiltration. We have a small window before they lock everything down. If we coordinate across different cells, we can sabotage their broadcast, or at least cause enough chaos to embarrass them publicly." They spent the next days meticulously planning. Messages were sent to allied groups. Some planned to protest outside the rally, drawing the attention of security forces. Others would blend in with the crowd and wait for a signal. When the day arrived, Javier felt his nerves thrumming with a mixture of dread and anticipation. He dressed again in one of his simplest outfits for Julieta, trying to blend in with the many women supporters the regime had bussed in to cheer. The rally took place in the massive central plaza, overshadowed by the old fortress that served as a government stronghold. Giant speakers were set up to blast patriotic songs, and rows of flags fluttered in the wind. Sophia, wearing a plain blouse and a headscarf, stood beside Javier in the crowd. Daniela and others were scattered among the throng, each of them armed with only their wits and the plan they had drilled into their minds. On stage, military officials gave long speeches praising the regime's so-called progress. From a certain vantage point, Javier could see marksmen on the rooftops, scanning the crowd for threats. He kept his head bowed slightly, not wanting to draw attention. Next to him, Sophia subtly slipped a small device from her pocket. It was a signal transmitter rigged to jam the broadcast feed for a few seconds once activated. Those few seconds of confusion would be their chance. The moment arrived when the head of the regime stepped to the microphone, about to address the nation. Sophia pressed the switch. The giant screens around the plaza flickered, and the speakers emitted a shrieking noise. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Security forces rushed toward the stage, baffled by the sudden glitch. That was the cue. From the back, a group of protesters held up signs and started chanting slogans against the regime. Some attempted to rush the barricades. Soldiers fought to maintain order, and the crowd buckled under the tension. As the screens continued to stutter, additional men and women in on the plan began shouting about the government's lies, fueling the chaos. In the midst of it all, Javier and Sophia slipped closer to the stage, weaving through stunned onlookers. Their goal was to toss small paint bombs at the foot of the platform, a symbolic act that would further humiliate the regime on camera. Javier clutched 2 round orbs filled with bright red paint hidden in a cloth bag. A soldier suddenly blocked their path. "Turn around, no one goes closer!" Sophia feigned panic, waving her arms as if confused. Javier lurched to the side, creating a momentary diversion. The soldier reached out, but Sophia ducked under his arm. Javier seized the opportunity, hurling one paint bomb toward the base of the stage. It splattered brilliantly across the podium, splashing onto the uniforms of a few high-ranking officers. Gasps and angry shouts erupted. Before the soldier could react, Sophia threw another paint bomb, which burst at the official's feet. The stage looked like it had been doused in red, a striking statement right before the cameras that were still struggling to broadcast the event. In the confusion, Javier and Sophia retreated back into the panicked crowd. Soldiers tackled anyone nearby, blindly trying to restore order, but the chaos was too widespread. Eventually, as the jamming device wore off, the screens flickered back to life, showing glimpses of the stained podium and the disarrayed officials. For a brief moment, the regime's show of power had been turned into a spectacle of embarrassment. Afterwards, the crackdown came. Soldiers rampaged through the crowd, seizing suspected agitators. Javier and Sophia barely escaped the plaza by climbing over a half-broken fence and sprinting down a side street. Exhausted, adrenaline pounding, they made it to a safe gathering point where Daniela and others arrived in small groups throughout the night. They had taken a risk, and though they hadn't toppled the regime, they had made a statement that would echo far beyond that day. The next morning, the official press tried to spin the incident, claiming it was an isolated act of vandalism. But rumors spread faster, especially with images leaked by those in the crowd. The paint-splattered stage became a symbol of resistance. In the following weeks, more open protests erupted throughout the country. Some were put down violently, but the people's outrage was reaching a boiling point. The government's tactics of fear and intimidation were no longer enough to silence everyone. The revolution, once scattered and disorganized, was finding its momentum. And within that rising tide, the group that Javier had joined, disguised as Julieta, was recognized as playing a pivotal role. However, with that recognition came danger. Whispers circulated among the regime's higher-ups about a mysterious woman inciting unrest. A few grainy photos from the rally showed a figure that vaguely resembled Giulietta near the stage. Javier realized that his disguise might soon be compromised. Late one night, Daniela pulled Javier aside. She wasted no time getting to the point. "They have pictures of you. Soldiers are going door to door in some neighborhoods, searching for any sign of this Giulietta. You're becoming too well known." Javier pursed his lips. "But we've accomplished so much. I can't just leave now." Daniela's features softened, which was rare for her. "You don't have to leave the fight entirely, but you need to keep yourself alive for all of our sakes. If they capture you, it'll be a severe blow to the movement." Sophia, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward. "We've arranged a possibility for you to slip across the border, at least until things calm down here. There are allied groups in the next country who can shelter you." The thought of fleeing made Javier's stomach clench. He looked around at the cramped safe house, at the people who had become his trusted comrades. Then his eyes lingered on Sophia. "You're all staying?" he asked quietly. Daniela nodded. "We have to." Javier glanced at Sophia, and she held his gaze. It pained him to imagine leaving her, but he understood that if he stayed, he might bring more danger to everyone else. That night, the group solemnly prepared for Javier's departure. They helped him dress in a simpler outfit, one that would stand out less in the border regions. Sophia handed him travel papers, carefully forged, and a small sum of money. They planned to have him escorted by 2 women from another cell who were traveling to meet with allies on the other side. Before dawn, Javier stepped outside, the chill of the early morning air biting at his cheeks. Sophia waited by the entrance, arms folded. When he approached, she gave him a gentle, sad smile. "Be safe," she said softly. He tried to maintain composure, though emotion pressed on his throat. "You too. And don't forget, we've come this far. One day, this nightmare will end." She nodded, her eyes shining. In a hesitant motion, she reached out and gave him a tight embrace. They stood like that for a moment, holding on to the hope that their cause and their bond would survive the crucible of the revolution. At last, Javier pulled away. He joined the 2 escorts who waited for him. The city streets were still dark and empty as they began the long journey toward the outskirts. With each step, Javier felt the ache of leaving behind Sophia, Daniela, and the other women who had risked so much. But as he took that road, he recalled every brave act they had shared and every glimpse of resilience he had witnessed. Even in his temporary departure, he was convinced that the seeds of change had been planted. The cross-country networks were growing stronger, the people were less afraid to voice dissent, and the government struggled to maintain the illusion of invincibility. Javier, once a hunted activist forced to conceal himself as Giulietta, now carried with him the knowledge of how the undercurrent of rebellion was shaped not just by men in the streets, but also by the women who led from the shadows. By the time he reached the border, the first rays of sunrise glinted across the hills. He adjusted the scarf around his wig, keenly aware of the risks that still lay ahead. Yet his resolve burned bright. He would find a way to continue the fight from wherever he was, and if the time came for him to return, he would stand alongside Sophia and the others once more. As the sun broke over the horizon, he cast one last look at the skyline of his homeland. He could almost picture the row of crates by the waterfront where this journey had begun, the cramped apartment where Sophia first proposed the disguise, and the hidden cellar where the group had planned their risky missions. He whispered a silent vow to those memories, then turned to walk toward the promise of another place, another strategy, and another chance to help free his country from tyranny. He did not know what the future would bring for the revolution or for his place within it. But he knew, without a shred of doubt, that the spark they had lit would not be extinguished. Even as he crossed the border in the guise of Giulietta, he carried forward the determination that had driven him all along, the commitment to stand with his people, no matter how many disguises he had to wear, until victory was finally within their grasp. In that determination lay the possibility that one day, when the dust settled and the regime fell, he might stand openly as Javier once again side by side with Sofia, no longer forced to hide. Until that day, he would remain the revolutionary in disguise, forever shaped by all he had witnessed among the courageous women who had welcomed him into their ranks. He took a breath and stepped over the boundary line, the early morning sky painting the path ahead in soft colors of dawn. The journey was far from over, but he held his head high and continued on, determined to rejoin the fight in whatever way he could.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.